Moving on here. Hey, top fan Steve Darrow says I may have been binge watching too many time travel type shows on Netflix, but if you could erase Karl Marx from history, would you? How would the world be different if Karl Marx's mama hadn't met Karl's daddy? Would his awful ideas still have surfaced in some other form without him? My hypothetical is based on the existence of Marxist ideology as a science instead of just a collection of stupid ideas. I wonder if the power of having it been formalized into an ism carries weight with the useful idiots. That's a fine question. Here's my first response to this time travel parody, Steve, and with the caveat that this is as impossible as what I just suggested with the Ruth Bader Ginsburg thing. But this at least is presents some interesting historical connections. When you said as I was reading it in the middle of the sentence, I thought, okay, so if I go back and knock off anybody, would it be Karl Marx or would it be Hitler or Stalin? And then I realized, wait a minute, if you take out Karl Marx, you don't get Hitler or Stalin. You don't get either of them. Hitler entire first half of the time before he became chancellor, after World War I and before he became chancellor in 1933, so right up until, from 1919 right up until 1927, 28, 29, something like that. He was basically, the National Socialists were a street fighting party. And the National Socialists came to power because they were the only people in Germany who were willing to fight the communists with fists and bats and beer mugs out on the streets. That's where they got their power. Um, so so if you don't have Marx, you don't get Hitler, and you don't get Stalin either, or Lenin. Um, and and the thing that's so tragic about this is that now it's entirely possible, of course, that somebody else could have done it. I don't know. Maybe I've never understood the appeal of it. I don't find the idea interesting. I find it reprehensible, and I don't find it well written or any of that stuff. But in any event, I think the reason Marx had the impact that he did was that there was probably a 20-year window somewhere in there where you could be Karl Marx. And if you were born before that or after that and you're Karl Marx and you write the same things, it's not going to catch fire. The reason that Marxism took off the way it did was we were deep enough into the Industrial Revolution for almost all of society to be moved into industrial jobs. And at the same time, we're still so early in the Industrial Revolution that the conditions were simply unbelievable. Unbelievable. The conditions of, again, my personal family conditions, which I've gone to some detail looking into. If you get a chance, I've mentioned this before, if you get a chance to read The Road to Wigan Pier, Wiggan, by George Orwell, the second half of it's just bilge, but the first half of it is an extraordinary description of what being a British coal miner is all about. And little things you never forget, like the fact that these guys had scabs and calluses over each one of their vertebrae from banging up against the ceiling, because their ceiling is 3 feet tall, and they're walking along bent over. That many of these people, after being down in the caves, in the mines for a while, started to look like they'd been tattooed, because if they get the tiniest little cut, and you're getting coal shards flying everywhere at high speed, you're smashing them into with a pick and stuff. These little tiny razor sharp coal shards cut your face. The problem is that once they cut your face, there's so much coal dust in the air that it immediately gets filled with coal dust, heals up with coal dust in it, and it becomes a tattoo. That's a big problem. And so he had to come at a time when conditions for working people were so unbelievably intolerable that everybody, up to and including aristocrats and intellectuals, thought that this was a good idea, only because what they were seeing in the world of capitalism was just so appalling that they were desperate for something else. Now, this is the nice thing about this audience. Not 47 yet. Said, what about killing Gavrilo Princip just before he shoots Archduke Franz Ferdinand? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 starts the First World War. And if you get into the details about the first couple of weeks of the war, really even the first couple of hours of the war, you have a sense. Watching the First World War get started reminds me of that scene in what's it called? Oh my God. I should know this. It just slipped out of my head. It's the Steven Spielberg movie about a slave ship. I want to say it's Amadeus, but it's not. It's anyway. There's a scene in that movie which will appear in the comment section in about 5 seconds, where they've decided they either don't have enough food for some of the slaves or whatever. Amistad, thank you. So what they do is they have a line of 15 or 20 slaves chained together, and they pitch a weight over, and each one of them is pulled off the boat into the ocean to drown one by one, but very quickly. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. And that's how the beginning of World War I feels to me, is that everybody's chained to this weight, and nobody can stop it. The only person who could have stopped it was the Kaiser. But the reason I think that's probably even a better choice, because if you don't have World War I, you don't have Marxism either. At least I don't think so. World War I. The World War I destroyed optimism. It destroyed optimism and belief in ourselves. The death camps and stuff that we discovered after World War II put the final nails in the coffin. But World War I was so awful and killed the very best people. It killed the very, very best people, especially in Britain. These were extremely decent, very civilized, gentle, kind people. They were poets and engineers and writers. They were just these fresh-faced kids. And then this giant war starts, and they haven't had a real war for 100 years. And they're marching out there to do Napoleonic tactics with machine guns and barbed wire, a flower of a generation, to say the least. And as I said before, Sorticus just said it twice. England. The reason England fell apart after World War II is they lost the best people in their generation, and then a generation later they lost the best people of that generation too. But when you see the quality, just and I don't mean the quality in terms of high quality. I mean just the characteristics of the men that went to World War I. They may have been the best people that we ever produced. World War II produced the greatest generation, and they were by far the toughest generation. If you had people from World War II fighting World War I, there'd be no question in my mind who would win. I think the World War II Americans would kick the daylights out of the World War I Americans, or whoever. Because by that point, everybody lost faith and hope in religion, humanity, progress, all of that stuff. But the First World War soldiers, at least in the beginning, and not even in the beginning, right after the beginning. In the beginning, the British were fighting with their professional army. The British Army was, a small army, and it was made up of, basically lifelong soldiers. It wasn't very big. And after the war started and the trenches start to happen and all the maneuvering is over, they realize they're going to need a lot more men. And so Kitchener, who was the what we had been Minister of Defense, War Minister. Anyway, Kitchener was a very popular British general from previous wars, and it's actually Kitchener who first did the "I Want You." The "I Want You" picture of Uncle Sam is actually a direct photocopy ripoff of Kitchener's World War I campaign. But Kitchener had the idea when he started needing troops in 1914 and 15. He had the idea that he would form PALS regiments, and his idea was we'd be able to recruit people if we promised them that they could serve together. That's why they called it PALS Regiment. You would go down and you would go with your buddies, and if you joined up, you'd be basically guaranteed that you would all serve in the same unit. So you'd get to be friends. And we're friends now, and we're friends out there, we'll have a jolly good adventure and all the rest of it. And there are many things wrong with that. But the most heartbreaking was when you had a situation like the Somme or Operation Michael in the end of the war, 1918. When you have that kind of bloodshed, certain units take it on the chin. You know, if there's a British assault and there's, for the sake of the argument, 100 British regiments and 15 or 20 of them are on the point, those regiments are going to be essentially wiped out almost to the man. And if you wipe out a PALS regiment, you've wiped out an entire village. You've taken all the men out of that village, all the young men out of that village. That kind of 70, 80, 90% casualties are not spread around the country. It's right there in this little town. Everybody's gone. They wake up one morning and they hear there was some giant battle, and the Lancashire 14th PALS Regiment was basically destroyed to a man, and that neighborhood has lost everyone. It really is a kind of a don't put all your eggs in one basket kind of thing. Everybody's seen Saving Private Ryan. Same idea. Saving Private Ryan's based on an actual story. In World War II, there were 5 brothers called the Sullivans. They all enlisted in the Navy together. And I want to say they were on was it the Juneau, the Anchorage? I'm pretty sure it was named after Alaska. Anyway, it was a cruiser, and all 5 brothers were aboard, and the cruiser sank, and 4 of the brothers were killed. 5th brother, the eldest one, the Juneau, I thought so, yeah, thanks. The 5th brother made it out and got on the raft, and he was the oldest brother, and what they didn't tell the parents, the Sullivan parents, they didn't tell anybody until well after the war, essentially was that Juneau good, was that John Sullivan survived. He was on the raft, went out to rescue people who were on individual life jackets and stuff. He went out, grabbed a guy, swam him back to the raft, went out, grabbed another guy, swam back to raft, went out, grabbed a 3rd guy, and that 3rd guy got torn apart by sharks, and then a few minutes later, Sullivan, I think it was George Sullivan, also torn apart by sharks. He's there, and next thing you know, there's a scream and thrashing water and blood, and he's gone, disappeared. Horrible way to go. So after that, they decided they're not going to put people in the same unit together, and they in fact named a destroyer the Sullivans, and that name has never left. I think we still have a Sullivans, the USS. It's interesting. We name our destroyers usually after Marine Corps heroes, Marine Corps or naval heroes, but most often Marine Corps. And so you'll have the Navy admirals. I was on board the Spruance, and and then there's the names of all of these guys who are individual heroes in the Marine Corps. But there was one ship, and its name was the USS The Sullivans. It wasn't USS Sullivan. It was USS The Sullivans. Really interesting, and I'm just so deep into that naval history now, and the more I read about Battle of Leyte Gulf, the more amazed I become. And as usual for me, once I find something that I really get interested in, I drill down to it so deep I actually feel I could probably write a master's thesis on the Battle of Leyte Gulf now. And it's not that I'm a particularly great historical mind, but certainly, without question, I could write a master's thesis that would get me past universities today. Oh, I'm eating your face. Who's here? Hey, buddy, how are you? We see him out in the universe. Said he served on the Bella Wood and the Bonhomme Richard, and I didn't know that. Thank you. That's good. I didn't know that about you. Bonhomme Richard. That's an interesting name. Those ships are amazing. I was on an Aegis class destroyer, and I was so impressed. And then I read about all these new ships that Japan is building, 7 destroyers for every one that we build. Um, and that's alarming. And then I start telling myself things to make me feel better, and this is something I worry about quite a lot. I worry when I start to justify these things, I start to wonder whether or not this is true or whether or not I want it to be true. One thing I'm sure of is if I assume it's true, then we're going to get bitten. But basically what I'm saying is this. The Russians will announce they've got an airplane, or the Chinese. We've got a stealth fighter, and it's an F-22 killer, and it's an F-35 killer, and it's going to go up there and it's going to wipe the sky of these American planes. And my response to that is, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think the technology is as good. I don't think the weapons systems are as good, but I know for an absolute certain fact the training is not as good, and that's what it all comes down to. You got 2 pilots, 2 Air Force pilots, and you put one of them in a good plane and one of them in a mediocre plane or even a bad plane, the good pilot's going to win. And so when I hear the Chinese talking, this is going to destroy the Navy and this is going to do this and this is going to do that, I'm not impressed because combat does 2 things. It has a way of testing weapons platforms. If you've got a problem with the M2 Bradley as an exception to the rule, M4 Sherman being a much better example, you take what you think is a good idea out into the field, and it turns out to be not such a good idea. That costs people's lives. And so it's not just that our hardware has been flight tested and sea tested. It's also, I cannot imagine that I already know this isn't true because no one else can do this. No one else does it. But nothing out there looks anything like the Navy when the Navy's launching and recovering aircraft. I mean, it's true. I've seen Su-33s landing on a Russian aircraft carrier, and I've seen them launching, and the Su-33 is not a bad airplane, and it's got some capabilities. But when I watch them doing their operations, and they have 1 carrier, one. China's got 1, maybe a second one coming up. Britain just launched their Queen Elizabeth class. India has a carrier. French have a couple carriers. But nobody does. The only 2 people in the history of the world ever did carriers, and that's the Americans and the Japanese. And I'm not convinced. So the question is, if they build 7 destroyers or 9 destroyers for every one of ours, does that mean that they're going to kick our asses? And we got a big head start in terms of numbers. We got a big head start in terms of the dollars spent. And the part I worry about is that I worry when I start worrying about this, I start telling myself things like, okay, well, they may have the ships, but they don't have the operational capability. They don't have the training. They don't have the crew. They don't have the morale. And then I wonder, is this how Pearl Harbor happens? Are we just completely underestimating these people? So I would like to think that it's true, but I would certainly not plan on it. I would certainly plan on being ready for them. But all of our warts are out on display militarily, and none of theirs are. The Chinese, as it turns out, somebody may correct me on this or back me up on it, as the case may be. The Chinese are as bad or worse than the Japanese when it comes to inter-service rivalries. The Japanese army was not informed that the Japanese Navy was going to go fight the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They were not told about it. Or if they were told about it the day before the event happened. And if it hadn't been for that, if there's so many cases where the Japanese Army and Navy were not only not cooperating, they were just on completely different books. And if they had cooperated, we'd be in a lot more trouble. My understanding is that China has a great deal of this inter-hostile, kind of thing. So anyway, People are apparently tired of hearing about the Navy, so that's what we'll do is we'll end a little talk about the Navy. But regardless of the Navy or Special Forces or their latest F-35 killer, whatever, first of all, you have to see it tested in combat. Secondly, you have to develop tactics and strategies for it that work. And you don't go out in the field and find these things the right way, the right time. You have to lose people and learn hard lessons. And we've learned those hard lessons. This military is the most combat-hardened, lethal force that we've ever had. And so I'm encouraged about that. I was very pleased by the look on the executive officer of the Pasadena's face. I was exceedingly pleased, as a matter of fact. We were submerged almost 2 years ago, maybe 2.5, and we were under the Pacific at 600 feet below the surface doing 22 knots. And I got a chance to talk to the executive officer for a while, and he's basically showing me a display of what is essentially the inverted analog of airspace. He's showing me sea space off of San Diego, blocked off areas. We got this is an area for training. Here's a weapons thing, all this other stuff, and so on. It's kind of cool. And I asked him, I said, so, what do you guys do, when somebody comes, sniffing around? What do you mean? He said, what happens when a Russian sub or a Chinese sub decides to come into these waters? And the guy just burst out laughing. He said, really? And I said, yeah, I'm serious. No, they're not getting anywhere close to this stuff. And I suspect that's because China can talk all it wants to, and Russia can talk all it wants to, and this is true for the Air Force, true for the Marines, Army, and Navy as well. You have a new weapon system, or you got this groovy supersonic missile, whatever. I'll tell you what they don't have is they don't have a network of sensors where we have microphones under the water of the entire surface of the planet. Used to be just across the GI-UK gap, and the little gap between Greenland and Iceland and Great Britain, where the Russian surface and submarine fleets would have to come down to attack NATO convoys. We used to have listening buoys there. We got them everywhere now. We can hear. I don't know this for a fact. I'd be amazed if it weren't true. I don't want to know, because if they capture me and torture me, I'm going to give it to them in 10 seconds. But it seems to me that very likely, exceedingly likely, in fact, it seems to me a practical certainty that we know where every single submarine and surface ship on the planet is at all times. I think we know at all times. One of the hardest things about listening for a submerged contact in a submarine is the sound of your own sub. These don't have to worry about that. They don't have to worry about their weight. They can just sit there at the bottom of the ocean and listen. And I would imagine that the intelligence net and the computer net that is processing all of these different sonar targets is extraordinarily sophisticated. And I know this must be true because, as a strange little story, my mother's father did the same thing. My mother's father, my grandfather, Alfred, whom I am named after, was in the Royal Marines, and after World War II, he was in the Royal Navy, worked with Royal Naval Intelligence, and he was given the Order of the British Empire for his work after the war. And what my grandfather did was he knew, it wasn't the whole ocean, but it was Britain's ocean. He knew every single ship in the Mediterranean. He knew where it was going, and what it was carrying. And he didn't have sensor nets or satellites or electronic computers or anything like that. My grandfather, along with the rest of these bright men in Royal Navy Mediterranean Command, had a gigantic, enormous map of the Mediterranean, just like their RAF counterparts did. And they had little wooden blocks, and these blocks had the name of the ship written on it. And they would just move them along with little push sticks, like croupier sticks from the casinos. And you could ask my grandfather at any given time of day or night, for the years he did it. You could say, we have a ship named this, and it's left this port 2 days ago. And they'll say it'll be in Messina at 1100 on Thursday. Or we've got something out there we don't know what it is. It's got one funnel. It's about 270 feet long. It's probably the Lancashire, that kind of thing. So China doesn't have any of these things. That's not that they don't have intelligence, but they don't have this kind of coordination. They don't have this kind of sensor net. Submarines, certainly, and surface ships to some degree. The best way I've ever heard of it is described as a submarine combat is it's a game of hide and seek with bazookas. So the problem's not killing the guy. You put a torpedo into another submarine, and it's pretty much the end of the argument. The question is not lethality. The question is detection. And as soon as you've detected the enemy, your chances have gone. And he hasn't. Assuming you detect the enemy before he detects you, your chances have become astronomically greater. And I was worried about North Korean Navy launching missiles out of a sub. They did a subsurface launch, or either that or they went to the surface and launched. But in any event, I thought the ability to move those missiles around is not good for us, complicates things for us. And then I thought, as if that sub is ever going to have a chance to launch, never. That North Korean missile boat, if that thing starts to come up and hover at launch depth, and they hear the doors opening, and we were convinced that this was real serious effort, that thing would be a hole in the water before anything ever happened. I know for a fact those Korean subs, whatever they are being pursued by American subs, and we can probably hear the Korean subs from Hawaii when they're heading out of their ports in Korea. I'm quite certain that when Chinese submarines and Russian submarines leave their ports, they are tailed immediately by very, very capable crews. Moving out of Los Angeles-class submarines now into Virginia-class subs, which are even better. And so it's something to make you sleep a little easier at night. It makes me sleep easier at night. Anyway, let's do a couple more and we'll move on, I'm afraid. Until next week.